Graveyard, Indiantown, Florida, spring of '99, age 19. Michelle and Zach flew in from St. Thomas a few weeks before my planned departure from Ocean City. They were deeply tanned and physically fit, wearing that glow of a couple during the honeymoon phase of their relationship. I met them at the gate and hugged them both, happy to see them and excited to show them my new life in Fort Lauderdale. And I secretly wondered if maybe Michelle was going to be tired of Zach now that they had spent their winter together, and if maybe she would leave him and we could go and get our boat now. My money had all been spent, but I figured that we could find a way to rebuild our dream if we wanted to. As soon as we'd hugged our hellos, Michelle held up her left hand. "Look at this," she said. A gold band shaped like a small dolphin curved around her ring finger. A diamond sparkled in the center. I took her hand and sighed over the ring, the way one woman is supposed to sigh over another's engagement ring, and congratulated them both. Marriage was something that at 19 I hadn't thought much about. Even in talking to Cole about moving aboard his boat, the subject had never come up, and Carrie and I were just biding our time and having fun. I realized later that perhaps our relationship had meant more to Carrie than this, but at the time he was simply someone who could show me a different life and teach me how to fish for big game. Tim hadn't spoken much of marriage except to talk about his divorce, although he did marry Marina after their daughter was born. Now Michelle stood before me with Zach and beamed over her ring. I bristled inside, part of me wanting to tell her that she was too young, but the more rational side of me asking myself what it really meant to be too young. But what really got me was that Zach wasn't a sailor, even though he had made every effort to learn and had read all the books and had learned how to sail just as well as anyone. He was still an outsider. This was his final act in the play that had begun a year before. He was stealing Michelle away from me. I wondered how she could marry someone who didn't understand her as much as I did. Michelle could not marry someone who wasn't a sailor. These were my thoughts, but I stood and smiled and resolved to learn more about the men Michelle was choosing to spend her life with. Years later on a camping trip in Death Valley, Zach asked me why I didn't like him. When we first met, "I didn't know you, Zach." I said Zach and Michelle and I sat on the back of their truck, the sun sinking over the mountains and coyotes yipping in the distance. "I like you plenty now," I said, "and I'm sorry I didn't give you a fair chance. You were stealing Michelle from me." But in South Florida in '99, we sat in the Dodge Shadow and talked about their plans and my plans. They were going to buy a car from her dad's lot and move up to Wisconsin for a while. We ended up later that night in Palm Beach, aboard the boat that Carrie captained. Carrie, drunk, pulled an M16 out of one of the lockers and showed it to Zach, and the two of them compared notes on automatic and semi-automatic weapons, while Michelle and I sat on the stern of the boat and talked. I drank a beer and Michelle drank water. "What do you think of this fishing thing?" Michelle gazed up at the bridge, where the stainless steel and white fiberglass glistened in the humid night. "I like it," I said. "It's all boating. Whether you are sailing or fishing, it's the being on the water that I like." This was true. Traveling at high speeds on a brand new sport fishing boat thrilled me. The sight of a sailfish spinning on the water behind the boat while being reeled in, and the smell of fish blood from the dolphin and mackerel that we caught and kept were magical and made me feel alive. "I'm ready for a little bit of a break," Michelle said. "All those tourists in St. Thomas can get to you. And the crew, they just party and drink at night and don't save any of their money. You can make a fortune down there if you don't spend it all, but they don't seem to realize that. "I guess you guys managed to save up," I said. "Yeah." She twirled the ring on her finger. I wondered what she thought of me now, my drinking and partying and excessive spending that far outweighed my minimum wage salary. "Is Zach going to get to meet your dad while you're here?" I nodded towards the lit salon cabin, where the silhouettes of Carrie and Zach and the M16 rippled across the canvas blinds. "Dad still won't meet him," Michelle said, "because he's not a witness." "I guess. I don't know. I'm officially disfellowshipped now," she said. "I don't even think my dad is supposed to see me." "That's not right," I said. "Well, I guess my dad really believes in his religion." Over the years, the Jehovah's Witnesses had tightened their grip on Gary and his family, who attended the weekly meetings at the Kingdom Hall and socialized only with other witnesses. The next day I dropped Michelle off in Port St. Lucie on the coast to spend the day on the beach with her dad and the kids. It turned out that family ties were stronger than religion, and Gary wanted to see his daughter after all. Zach and I took off towards Indiantown, wondering if we were going to pass the family going in the opposite direction. Gary wanted to see Michelle, but still wasn't ready for a face-to-face meeting with the man who had stolen her away. I told Zach about Indiantown and about Central Florida while we drove. The shadows top down and the heat oppressive. The ice-cold air on my car had stopped working a month after I bought it, so the fact that it was a convertible was a blessing. I told Zach about the orange groves and about how Florida was second only to Texas in raising beef cattle, and how Lake Okeechobee fed the Everglades, and how the middle of the state was a close match to continental Africa in terms of flora and fauna. And of course, I told Zach about the adventures that Michelle and I had growing up, the sailing dinghies and the beaches, and meeting up in random harbors throughout the years. Zach was a good conversationalist, and despite the grudge that I carried against him, I found that I enjoyed talking to him. He asked hard-hitting questions for which I didn't have answers, like, "Why do you think Michelle's dad doesn't like me?" and "What do you think made you and Michelle grow apart?" To his second question, I wanted to respond, "We didn't grow apart, you asshole, you ripped us apart." But I didn't. I liked Zach in spite of myself. We drove through Indiantown past the car lot, which was just a small lot with about 24 old cars sitting in the overgrown weeds, and an air-conditioned trailer for an office. That's it. Zach's eyes followed it as we rolled past. We turned at the road that led past the post office and to the marina, driving gradually downhill until we reached the water, and turned right to weave through the fiberglass jungle of the dry storage area. Sailboats of all shapes and sizes sat on jackstands, and I read the names on their sterns as we navigated through them. The names were all familiar. All of these boats I had seen in the Bahamas at some point in my childhood. All of them had owners that lived somewhere north of Indiantown, and who had either put them in storage for the season or had stored them permanently or semi-permanently while trying to make a few more bucks to fund the dream. Maybe it was as simple as that. I thought, as simple as finding the means. My dad had been smart enough, worked hard enough, and been lucky enough to land and win the big case that paid for our early years of cruising, and he'd been gifted with the art of storytelling and known how to use it to fund the dream in our later years. But what very few of the cruising how-to books ever told you was how to pay for a lifestyle that didn't allow for regular jobs in regular offices. People on boats were either rich, lucky, or strapped for cash and living on a short shoestring. Usually they saved up money to cruise for a year and then went back to shore or settled when the money ran out. A very few, like my father, found ways to sustain themselves afloat. The boats in Indiantown were empty vessels, each having carried dreams and each having been left or abandoned. Even those that were temporarily stored seemed sad to me. I'd seen these boats poised on aquamarine water swaying on their anchor lines, or cutting across the banks under full sail, the proverbial bone in the teeth of a white wake spreading out from the bow. Names like Voyager, Wandering Spirit, Southern Cross, and North Star were written across their sterns in various fonts and colors. Finally, somewhere in the middle of the jungle, we reached Summer Wind. Michelle had told us where to find the key hidden under the welcome aboard mat. We propped a paint-covered boatyard ladder up against the hull and climbed aboard, me leading the way and securing the ladder once I reached the top. Zack followed tentatively and stepped aboard, looking around and taking it all in. The tattered bimini top and the unvarnished teak and the scuffed fiberglass deck. Since Michelle had been gone, nobody had really cared for Summer Wind. Inside the cabin, where I had spent so many happy moments, the air was damp and musty. We ventured into the forward cabin, where Michelle had instructed us to look for bags of clothes, letters, books, and a few other things that she didn't want to be without on her move to Wisconsin. I listened for the knocking on the hull of someone from the marina or a curious boater, and wondered what I would tell them if we were discovered. After all, we were both trespassing and stealing. Zack walked through the boat in a trance, feeling the sides of the cabin and sitting down at the settee for a moment before moving to the aft cabin. I knew what must be going through his mind. In his less than a year of yachting, he had crewed aboard a former America's Cup racer, delivered a multi-million-dollar sailing yacht to the Virgin Islands, and then crewed aboard a utilitarian tourist boat. He had been aboard Chez briefly after he first arrived in Newport, but that memory had faded and been replaced by all the boats and places that came next. This boat, the boat that Michelle grew up aboard, and the boat from which she called him night after night when their relationship was beginning, was nothing like what he had imagined. It was humble and dirty, stout and unglamorous. It was as real gets. I let him think his thoughts as I forged through Michelle's stuff. We didn't have a whole lot of room in the shadow, and they would have even less on their drive to Wisconsin, so I placed what I thought would be important to her in bags and set them by the companionway. In a ziploc under a pile of clothes, I found a stack of letters that I had written to Michelle. I opened them and dumped them on the V-berth, spreading them out across the cushion and looking for dates or clues as to when I might have written them. My handwriting on the letters was neat and slanted, the cursive practiced, and I thought about how quickly it had gone to shit. Some of the letters were written on yellowing composition paper, and some were on brightly colored stationery, the kind that preteen girls in the early 80s bought and plastered with stickers of unicorns and dolphins. In one of the letters, written in '95, I read a paragraph I had written about a seafarer, 26, that I admired. It's docked at Narrows Marina, and the owner never do anything with it. I wrote, "It's so sad, such a waste of a boat, to see it just sitting there uncared for. I would never treat a boat that way, and I know you wouldn't either. When we get our own, we'll take such good care of it." I folded the letter back up and placed all the letters in the bag, stashing it with a pile of things that Zack and I planned to heist from Indian Town. We drove away that afternoon, both silent, both craning our necks to get a last look at Summer Wind, wishing her farewell for Michelle. Commercial Fishing, Ocean City, Maryland, 1999. I broke the lease on my studio apartment and packed everything into the Dodge Shadow. My mom helped me drive north to West Ocean City, Maryland, where we stayed in Carey's Marsh side cottage for 2 nights before driving Mom to the Baltimore airport, where she flew back to reconnect with Dad and Carolyn aboard Chez. I convinced a friend of Carey's to let me use the address of her double-wide as my residence. The double-wide had a spare room, and I put a few things there in case my parents ever showed up, and I needed to pretend to be living someplace other than Carey's house. The double-wide's owner bartended at a small bar that faced the narrow commercial harbor where the long liners docked between trips. The bar served a specialty drink of orange-flavored vodka mixed with Sprite and fresh squeezed orange juice, and late at night the fishermen would get into fistfights that sometimes landed them in jail. I cleaned boats in the evenings, as Carrie and I had planned, and during the day I detailed and waxed them with a local woman who drove a violet pickup truck and owned a boat detailing and fish cleaning business. I got a third job running a water taxi for a waterfront bar in Ocean City proper. The bar was called Secrets and was Jamaican themed, with loud reggae music playing over the outdoor speakers and frozen drink specials that brought in the Pennsylvania tourist by the hundreds. All three jobs were lucrative and kept me busy enough to not get irritated by the constant drinking, smoking, and partying of Carrie and his buddies. I loved West Ocean City, the smell of fish, both fresh and rotting, the seaweed that clung to the pilings and the bulkheads, the bait and tackle shop at the mouth of the harbor that sold minnows and live peeler crabs out of fiberglass basins. I got a job there on my second summer with Carrie and learned how to measure out pints and quarts of the squirming minnows to sell to sunburned fishermen and their eager crew. I loved the fishing and loved the booze and the money. I loved that I was oh so much cooler than the bimbos that typically hung out at the bars and marinas. There I could clean a fish and hold my liquor, and my captain's license allowed me to drive bigger boats than most of the men in the harbor were allowed to drive. I loved the brutal honesty of the place. One summer, the girlfriend of one of the longliners fell into the harbor and drowned, and they found her body floating between the boat and the dock on a Sunday morning. The official story was that she had fallen off the boat and hit her head, but the night before we had all seen her lover in the bar, swinging his fist at anything that moved, so naturally we all wondered what had really happened. Another summer, a small Cessna crashed offshore, and Carrie and a scuba diver friend of his were hired to retrieve the bodies from the plane. Carrie described the crabs that covered the bodies and how they made the bodies look like they were alive in the murky water. West Ocean City was to me like Florida was to Elizabeth Bishop, a place so alive with the poetry of life that I wanted to throw myself down into the marsh and writhe around like a minnow until my body was just part of the landscape. College, St. Petersburg, Florida, 99 to 2002, age 19 to 22. Eckerd College was perfect for me. It was near the base of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, an impressive suspension bridge over the mouth of Tampa Bay that I, during my first semester, drove across in the back in the shadow with the top down just for the hell of it. The college was small, expensive, and right on the water. It had a waterfront program with its own search and rescue team and kayaks that you could take out whenever you wanted to. Glossy mangroves lined the shore where I ran in the mornings, and white ibises clustered in the grass after the rain. I was awarded the maximum scholarship that the school offered. There was no such thing as a full ride at Eckerd. Took out loans, and my parents paid the balance of my tuition, room, and board. I had a work-study job repairing the boats owned by the college's waterfront program, and spent 3 afternoons a week upside down in their bilges doing electrical work, diagnosing engine problems, and sanding, painting, and varnishing. I moved into a small dorm room built in the 70s with a quiet and shy girl who was only 2 years younger than me but seemed to be 10 years younger. We were both weird, so we got along fine. She was a bookworm, and I was the boat girl. Whenever someone asked me where I was from, I had to explain how I grew up and how I was from a lot of places. If I liked the person and cared enough to tell my story, I told it. If I didn't, I just said that I was from Virginia and left it at that. I signed up for general education classes so I could get them out of the way. I came close to failing pre-calculus until I sought out a tutor and ended up with a B. It was one of the few Bs that I would earn in my academic career. I partied some, but not with the urgency of my peers. I drove to Palm Beach on the weekends where Carrie and I continued the lifestyle of the service class. I was driven and motivated, and instead of enjoying my new freedom and partying it up like the other freshmen, I dove into my books and did what I'd come to college to do. I learned like crazy. I spoke in class when some new piece of knowledge burned inside me, and argued when arguing was appropriate, and was silent when I didn't have anything to say. I stayed ahead on my homework since I already knew how to study on my own. Other kids put their essays and assignments off until the night before they were due. I turned mine in early, if at all possible. On the first week of my freshman year, I met a beautiful girl named Celia who was from Pennsylvania. I corrupted her with margaritas and fell softly in love with her the night I met her, and she would act as a sort of muse to me for the remainder of my time in college. She was a sweet, hippie girl with a classic goddess body and eyebrows that curved dramatically over the biggest indigo eyes I had ever seen. Celia was one of those women who everyone fell in love with, male or female. She made bad choices in men, and she defended her choices fiercely. She was an artist and a little bit of a witch, and I wrote poem after poem for her. I didn't show her poems for years. I didn't show her the poems for years. I went to see the movie American Beauty with some dorm mates. The rat race, normal lives of the family in the movie scared me. I wondered if I, with a degree in international business, would end up desperately driven to succeed financially, like the realtor mother, losing sight of all other things in my life. Looking back, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, since a degree in international business and a profession in real estate have very little to do with each other. But something about the movie spoke to me, and I knew that I didn't want to end up like those poor suckers. The next day, I went to the registrar's office and submitted the proper paperwork to change my major to creative writing. Writing was what I loved, so I decided it was what I would study, and even if I didn't make a career out of it, at least I would enjoy my college experience more if I spent it writing and analyzing poetry and short stories and reading great works of literature. I met a lot of girls, and in my sophomore-junior year, I lived in an on-campus apartment with 7 of them. Communal living appealed to me because in a lot of ways it was like being in a marina. There was always something going on, and if you needed a ride home from the bar or someone to give you a second opinion on an essay question, there was always a cheerful girl around to help. One girl had a prosthetic leg and lured the drunken college boys to her room with promises of sex only to remove the leg at the last minute, which either terrified them or coaxed them even further into their infatuation. One was from Minnesota and one from California. The California girl and I shared a room and became close friends. My college life really wasn't that spectacular or unusual. I drank a fair amount, but no more than before, pulled all-nighters writing screenplays and novellas, tried pot and ecstasy, founded a club for the creative writing students, and convinced the school to give us money to fund an alcohol-infused trip to Key West that involved a drag show and a visit to Hemingway House. Our club met weekly in the dorm, where we drank cheap wine from a jug and read each other's poetry and short stories and talked about how different and fantastic we were. The smells of oleander and burning citrus wafted in through the dorm room windows and blanketed us with their headliness. Ecstasy was the drug of choice at expensive private colleges in those days. We'd all heard the story about the student who jumped off the Sunshine Skyway Bridge because his serotonin was so depleted after he came down from a hard roll, as we called it, and we'd heard other stories about other students who jumped from windows or drowned themselves. Ecstasy was the suicide drug, but everyone I knew was willing to take the risk. Once Cecilia and the girl with the prosthetic leg and I drove the 7 hours to Key West, coming down from an ecstasy trip, the blue water and the low palm scrum flashing by us and shimmering. We drank rum once the E wore off and went to a strip club and stuffed dollar bills into the dancers' garters. Later we fell asleep in the back of the station wagon, the three of us pinned against each other. In the morning we snuck into a campground to shower and giggled and smiled as we emerged from the shower stalls clean and brand new. Cecilia said that ecstasy made her feel sparkly and erotic, and other people said it made you experience everything with a new level of awareness. I liked the idea of it, but the experience was different for me. I could never let go enough. Sheer physical enjoyment and sexual abandon were things I longed for, but things that I somehow could never quite reach. Inside, I was still Boat Girl and Buffalo Butt and Thunder Thighs. I was still a fighter slut and still worthless and harmful. And if my body and sexuality had caused me so much trouble over the years, then they certainly weren't things worth enjoying. Carrie and I camped in the Florida Keys one weekend and fished for tarpon while rolling on ecstasy that was from Palm Beach and was supposed to be much purer than what I had tried in Eckerd. Carrie was like that. If I had an experience in college, he tried to find some way to be a part of it, even if the experience was so far removed from his life that he had to reinvent himself for it. This ecstasy was strong and good, and we sat in a small boat underneath a bridge and watched the tarpon turn on their flashy steel-colored sides and take the sunlight and throw it back at us. We hooked a small one, and it floated above the water, where it leapt, and its scales seemed to disengage and shower us. If I'm going to do drugs, I thought, this is how it should be. On the water with nature and not at a crowded college party. But my drug days came and went, and either through luck or through my own willpower, I never permanently damaged myself. The Small Wedding, Racine, Wisconsin, fall of '99, age 19. Michelle called me one night on my dorm room phone to invite me to her wedding. Oh, I said, where are you going to have the wedding? Wisconsin. We found a lighthouse by the lake that we like. It's going to be a really small wedding. I'm not even getting a real dress or anything, she said. Just wear something black and sleeveless. Is your dad going to be there? No, she said. I wrote down the rest of the details and booked a flight and a hotel room, using the $1,000 credit limit card that my bank in Virginia had issued me in order to start building my own credit. Carrie met me in Tampa, and we flew into Chicago and rented a car. It was fall, and the weather was perfect. Michelle's mom hugged us hello at the Holiday Inn. Michelle was in the room adjacent to ours. Her mom had chilled champagne, even though Michelle still didn't drink, and Carrie and I didn't hesitate to pour glasses for ourselves. Michelle changed into her dress, a white sundress that Carrie remarked later looked more like something you'd wear underneath a wedding dress than an actual wedding dress. She sat in the cheap hotel chair looking uncomfortable while everyone else chatted. It was the night before the wedding, and Zach was off with his family. Michelle's mismatched family consisted of us, her mother and her mother's longtime boyfriend, her aunt, and a few cousins. We opened more champagne in the hotel room and talked about everything except for the pending wedding. When the champagne was gone, we switched to the airplane bottles of liquor that Kathy had brought with her so that we wouldn't have to raid the hotel's minibar. Michelle's aunt practiced the thick French braid that Michelle planned to wear the next day, piling and weaving Michelle's dark hair and tucking the end up underneath the braid at the nape of her neck. Somewhere in the haze of too many airplane bottles of different types of liquor, tears, and congratulations, Kathy and I decided that we should call up Michelle's ex-boyfriend. He's a sailboat guy, I said. He was the one who she dated when she was 14 and he was 18, and he'd cruised the Bahamas with his parents for several years. Now their boat sat rotting in Indian Town with all the others, and he lived in Ohio, which we calculated was close enough that he could drive to Wisconsin that night and show up at the wedding the next day. You should at least invite him, Kathy said to Michelle. Why, I haven't talked to him in years. Michelle kicked her small feet against the chair and pulled at the hem of her dress. He was so much better for you than Zach, I said. He's a boat guy. He understands you better. I squeezed one of the cheap plastic cups in my hand until the plastic cracked into shards, which I pulled apart one by one and tossed into the trash. I didn't know how much I'd had to drink at this point. Carrie and Kathy's boyfriend exchanged uneasy glances and simultaneously stood and excused themselves to the hotel bar downstairs. I don't know why you're bringing this up now, Michelle said. I'm getting married to Zach tomorrow. I know what I'm doing. I have his phone number somewhere in my purse. Kathy dug through her oversized bag. I had his number too in the old-fashioned address book that I carried, but I let Kathy do the digging while I searched for something else to drink. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hotel mirror, which had been so poorly cleaned that the corners were thick with dust. I'd changed just as much as Michelle had. I'd cut my hair short and gotten a perm, and the style didn't suit me. I'd done it just for the heck of it, walking into a hair cuttery in Ocean City that summer just after one of my daytime detailing shifts, and telling them that I wanted them to make me look dramatically different. Found it. Kathy held up an address book similar to mine. We all had cell phones, but storing numbers permanently in them was still something that people didn't do with the regularity that they do now. Kathy picked up her cell phone and dialed. What are you doing? Michelle jumped out of her chair and tried to grab the phone from her mother. I had the idea to run into the bathroom, and Kathy followed, shutting the door and locking Michelle out. In the bleach-smelling Holiday Inn bathroom, I could hear the phone ringing in Kathy's ear, and then a faraway voice answering, "Hello." "It's Michelle's mom." Kathy hissed it more than she whispered it into the phone. "And Melanie is here with me. Michelle is getting married tomorrow, and we want you to come." There was silence on the other end, and then a dramatic sigh. "Does Michelle want me to come? She doesn't know it, but she does. We don't like Zach, and we think she's making a mistake," Kathy said. Let me let you talk to Melanie." She handed the phone to me, and I took it and held it to my ear, not sure what I was feeling. I liked this guy. We'd done a lot of growing up together, and he'd taken me sailing in his hobby cat, ripping across the harbor in Georgetown on the face of the cold fronts that had most sane people rushing back to their boats to make sure their anchors were secure. He'd supported the idea of Michelle and me getting our boat. "Hi," I said. Michelle pounded on the door. "What's going on there?" The ex-boyfriend's voice was friendly and familiar. "I think maybe you should talk to Michelle," I said, reaching to unlock the door. She stood there, red-faced, the French braid unraveling and falling down her shoulders. I handed her the phone, and she stormed past me and motioned for her mother and me to leave. She locked the bathroom door behind us, and this time we were left on the outside, pressing our ears to the wall and door to hear what was being said. Michelle murmured into the phone, catching the ex up on her life since meeting Zach and on their plans, and assuring him that he didn't need to come to the wedding. After about 10 minutes of Kathy and me looking at each other, letting the gravity of what we'd just done sink in, Michelle opened the door and handed the phone back to her mom. "He's not coming," she said, "and this is my wedding, So if you don't like what I'm doing, you don't have to come either. I'm calling Zach to come and get me." Nobody spoke, and time went by, and Zach came and got Michelle. Carrie came back from the bar, and we all went to sleep. And the next morning, Michelle and Zach were married under the lighthouse. Michelle in her white sundress, and me in my black cocktail dress, mismatched and uncoordinated, with my perm blowing across my cheeks and scratching my face. Conch Farm, Bahamas, winter of 2001, age 21. Occasionally I crewed on the boat Carrie captained either up the coast or over to the Bahamas. We made a Bahamas trip in 2001, and I skipped a week of classes to go, since the owner and his family were staying aboard and were too cheap to pay for rooms ashore for Carrie and me. We slept on the flybridge in sleeping bags, the hard fiberglass hurting our backs. We woke in the morning as soon as the sun rose, sweating and scratching mosquito and no-see-um bites from the night before and nursing hangovers. On these mornings, my dad's anger crept into me, and I had to fight the urge to curse at Carrie or curse at his cheap-ass boss for not getting us a room. I stood on the bridge the third day of our trip and guided Carrie into the marina at Staniel Cay. Reading the water was a natural skill, and I had trouble understanding why someone wouldn't be able to do it. It was simple. Lighter aquamarine meant shallower water. Deep purple signaled coral heads. Brown meant rocky shoals that could hold a boat if they were hit under any kind of speed. Carrie nodded and drove the $1.5 million boat where I told him. In a rented Boston whaler, I took Carrie's boss's wife and kids to Compass Cay, where we explored the winding mangrove creek that had been my secret place as a kid. I showed the kids how to spot conch from the surface and dive in after them, and how to tell the fully grown and legally harvestable ones from the small rollers with the spiky shells. We collected enough conch for me to make fritters for all of us that night, and back at the marina at Staniel I cleaned the conch while the Bahamians and the Americans watched me. The Bahamians chuckled at the white girl who cut away the skin with clumsy slices using a dull fillet knife, and the Americans cringed at the slime and crud that caked my nails. The fritters were a hit, and later that night in the bar I sat and drank a Bailey's on the rocks and listened to the banter of the crowd. Carrie's boss was discussing drugs with the locals, and the locals schooled around him. I tuned it out and breathed in the smell of oleander and salt and mangroves and buttonwood and marijuana smoke that wrapped around me like home. Another boat from Palm Beach, whose captain Carrie vaguely knew, had arrived at Staniel that afternoon, and Carrie and the captain huddled over their colic gold beers and bitched to each other about their bosses. I was in a sunburn and sleep-deprived daze, half listening to them and half not, when I heard Carrie say, "I'll tell you where to get some conch if you want." "That would be great," the other captain said. "You know where Pipe Creek is, right?" Carrie drew on the bar's surface as if creating a map. "Sure." "Okay, you have to go all the way to the north end, where Compass Cay is," Carrie said. "There's a mangrove creek in the harbor there." I didn't want to listen to the rest of the conversation. I left my drink on the bar and walked out into the night. At the end of the dock, the boat rocked on, the gentle waves coming in off the Bahama banks. I climbed aboard and found my sleeping bag up on the bridge and tried to get to sleep as I played over what had just happened in my mind. One betrayal leads to another. The conch farm that my family had so carefully populated with rollers many years ago, and from which I had harvested on many occasions, was no longer a secret. I had led Carrie and his boss's family there for my own selfish reasons. I had wanted to show them what I knew and prove my worth, and I had made the sacred a little bit less so. Graduation, St. Petersburg, Florida, spring 2002, age 22. I graduated college in 3 years instead of 4 because the advanced classes I had taken through BYU were able to transfer, and because I took the maximum amount of classes that could be taken. Despite my partying and weekend trips to Palm Beach, I was a good and focused scholar. For my graduation, my parents rented a Cadillac and drove over to St. Petersburg from St. Augustine, where they were staying aboard Cheyenne for a short while and visiting Carolyn, who was in her second year at Flagler College. The Cadillac embarrassed me as it contradicted the lower to middle class identity that I'd tried to build among my peers. As I often explained to them, growing up on a boat didn't mean that we just sailed around to deserted tropical islands and drank pina coladas all day. We washed our own clothes by hand, caught all our own fish, and fixed everything ourselves. My parents parked the Cadillac right in front of my dorm and picked me up the day of graduation to drive me to Tropicana Field, where the ceremony was to be held. My dad combed his hair, even the hair underneath the matted top layer that never got combed, and my mom wore a dress. They sat in the bleachers and yelled and whistled as I walked up to get my diploma, terrified that I would trip in the high heels and that I still wasn't used to wearing. They beamed when my name was listed as one of those graduating with high honors, and they ardently shook hands with my favorite professors. They hosted a dinner that night at my favorite beachside restaurant and picked up the bar tab. They were proud I had almost become a normal, successful contributor to society. Almost. Book 3, Hurricane Trash. Short story. The Eastern Shore of Maryland, summer 2002, age 22. The bombs were going off in Tangier Sound. At first they sounded like thunder, but the only clouds were in the opposite direction, hanging over the Delmarva Peninsula, dark and heavy, dumping rain on the chicken farms. The bomb sound was unnerving. The military was testing some kind of explosives in the shallow water west of Crisfield, Maryland, reminding me how close I was to Washington, D.C. I wondered how many blue crabs and rockfish were being killed by each boom. I looked up from scrubbing the deck of my sailboat, shaded my eyes with my hand, and stared down the dock. I was waiting for my parents. A month ago I'd graduated from Eckerd College with a degree in creative writing, and 3 weeks ago I'd gotten my own sailboat. She was a 28-foot Columbia sloop, built in 1969. I was 22 and on my way to Florida International University in Miami for grad school. Carrie and I had driven out from West Ocean City on a Monday afternoon to look at her. We parked his pickup truck in a towaway zone, not expecting to be there long, and walked down the dock, peering at the name on each sailboat's stern. Most of the boats were old, from the days when their hulls were built with long overhangs and graceful lines. They bobbed as the wake of a crabber rolled beneath them, and clapped their rigging against the masts. My boat was all the way down at the end, looking proud and bigger than her 28 feet. There was a loud crashing sound and a flurry of movement, and a short gray-haired man popped out of the companionway hatch. He gave us the look I was used to getting by now. "You're way too young to buy a boat, and you're a girl." I had seen it on every face of every man in every marina where I had looked all up and down the East Coast. I'd been looking for a long time. The hatch squeaked as he slid it back. "Shit," the man said. He shook his hand and held up his thumb. "Slammed in the hatch," he said. I introduced myself. "Marlin," he said, holding out the hand that wasn't hurt. I found out later his name was spelled like the fish and not the actor. People tend to care more about fish than they did about famous people on Maryland's eastern shore. Marlin showed us the boat, told us he'd lived aboard it for a year in Salisbury, had a little heater to keep me warm in the winter, he said. "You can have it if you want." "I'm taking the boat to Florida if I buy it," I said. "Florida," he said, rolling the syllables over his tongue as if they tasted like pineapple. I don't think she'd ever been out of the Chesapeake. "Some day my lady and I are going to take our new boat to Florida." He pointed across the dock to a sleek 35-foot Pearson sloop. "I own 2 boats now," he said. "That's why I really need to get rid of this one." I didn't need to bargain with him. He dropped the price $2,000 before I even made an offer. Marlin was a welder, and he worked on a chicken farm in Delaware. "I welded these," he said, showing us the 2 stainless steel fuel tanks that sandwiched the Honda outboard. He told us about his new wife and about how lucky he was to have found someone who loved boats. "It's hard to find someone who wants to be cramped up in such a small space with you," he said. "You guys are lucky." I didn't say anything. Carrie and I would never make it living aboard a sailboat. We weren't planning on it. We'd talked about marriage a few times, casually and only while drinking, but I didn't think that it was in the cards for us. Marlin went on. "We had some good times on this boat. You see the V-berth. I made it into a queen-sized bed." "Yup, had some good times up there." He peered down the hatch at the little V-shaped bed up in the bow of the boat, and his eyes misted over. "You guys are young, you know what I mean." I tried not to picture Marlin and his wife naked in the V-berth. I was already thinking of it as mine. A few minutes later, I wrote a deposit check for $500, pending survey and sea trial. Short Story was the name I'd chosen for her. In 2002, the Chesapeake felt familiar to me, but still not like home. Crisfield is one of the many towns on the bay that depends completely on the water, which might be why the bombing in Tangier Sound irked me so much. The ratio of commercial boats to pleasure boats there was about 10 to 1. The crabbers and charter fishermen showed up early in the morning, before first light, and they headed out the harbor in a rumble of diesel engines. Everything there was geared to them. The 3 hardware stores along the main road, the tackle shops, the Captain's Galley restaurant. I was in the coffin-sized quarter berth under the cockpit with a spray bottle of X14 mildew remover when my parents arrived. I'd spent the morning cleaning. Marlin had apparently stopped cleaning the boat when he put it up for sale, and it was covered with mildew inside and out. I scooted out backwards through the quarter berth, coughing, threw a long t-shirt dress over my bikini, and climbed out the companionway hatch. They were standing on the dock. My mom loaded down with cameras, and my dad with a clipboard, 3 legal pads, and a canvas bag full of tools, and a flashlight, and whatever he might need in case the boat started to sink right there in its slip. Years of self-sufficiency had taught them to be prepared for anything. "Well," I said, "here she is." I climbed onto the dock to hug them and stand with them. I wondered what they saw when they looked at my boat, which they had generously paid for as a college graduation gift. I hadn't expected them to pay for the boat, and they surprised me when, after I found the boat I wanted, they asked me where to send a check. This hadn't been discussed, and I hadn't asked for it, but in the fashion of my parents, they gave unexpectedly and unceremoniously. Perhaps the underlying message was, "Now that you have gone to college and are bound for grad school, we feel like you have finally made something of your life, and so we'll give you what you have always wanted." I wondered whether they saw a trap, a leaky little ship into which I would end up sinking every penny I made, or whether they saw her the way I did, a smaller version of Chez Nous, something that felt more familiar to me than any house or apartment or town ever would. There was still a lot more cleaning to do, but the ugly green mildew spots were gone. The wake from a crabber made my boat jump a little in her slip, like she was ready to go, and her white hull reflected the Crisfield water in zigzag ripples. The blue boot stripe and the tow rail framed the slender overhangs at the bow and stern. She looked like a combination of all boats I had dreamed about while I was growing up. Classy but practical, slender but roomy, beautiful "It looks big," my mom finally said. "Are you sure it's only 28 feet?" "It's a big 28, I said. I remember these boats, my dad said, after going over it with his eyes, walking around to look at it from different angles. One of his best friends had worked for the Columbia Yard in Virginia in the 70s, right after my boat was built, and my parents had even thought about getting a bigger Columbia when they bought the Gulf Star 47. "It's amazing nobody's gotten electrocuted," Dad said, when he lifted one of the hatches to expose the batteries and the back of the electrical panel. He pointed his flashlight into the rat's nest of wires. I swallowed a small lump in my throat. There were a lot of things wrong with the boat, and I knew my dad would find them all, partially out of habit, but mostly out of concern for me. He would catalog everything that could catch fire, leak, or cause the boat to sink, and he would methodically remind me to fix them and help me fix what I needed help fixing. Eager to show them the things I'd already repaired, I pointed forward to the enclosed head, where I'd installed a new marine toilet. In the past 3 weeks, I'd installed a new bilge pump, replaced most of the plumbing, which involved sending pressurized water up to the sink in the head, and installed a shore power plug. I was still working summers at the bait and tackle shop in West Ocean City, and driving to Crisfield every time I had a day or an evening off. Back out on the dock, Dad made a list of some of the things that needed to be done: install 12-volt refrigeration, fix wiring, replace rigging. All of this would have to be done by the middle of August, when the boat was scheduled to be trucked to South Florida. Dad promised to help me sail across the Chesapeake in a couple of weeks to Narrows Marina, where the new Cheyenne was docked. Even though their boat was 25 years old and they had owned it for 4 years, I still thought of it as new. After my parents left, I made myself busy working on the boat. I worked best by myself. Carrie had helped me with some of the projects, which I appreciated, but without anyone around, I was faster and more efficient. I liked walking from hardware store to hardware store on Crisfield's main street, looking for the right part or fitting, and wondering what the crabbers and fishermen thought when they saw me carrying old fuel hose over my shoulder. Had I been a man, they wouldn't have paid me any attention, and sometimes I envied men for the freedom that they had to move through the world. I enjoyed my femininity. I liked to wear makeup and dresses, and I was vain about my thick hair. But men could eat alone at restaurants and sit alone at bars without receiving stares or unwanted advances, and men who slept around weren't called sluts. I was silent while I was there, talking about as much as necessary to make a purchase, content to live entirely within myself while I was on my boat. I fit inside her perfectly, my 5-foot body with its sturdy curves resting on the settee or ducking under the boom. Sometimes, while I was in Crisfield, I felt like I was watching myself from somewhere overhead. A young girl with her blonde hair chopped at her shoulders and sweat running down her neck and between her breasts. I felt like I was watching myself become the person I wanted to be. Carrie came out to the boat with me a few times, and we wrestled with hoses in the bilge, ran wires up and down the length of the boat, and drank beer and tried to figure out the boat's systems. But when he wasn't there, I was happy to be alone. That night, after my parents went home, I lay in short stories V-berth and listened to the bombs go off in Tangier Sound. It sounded like the end of the world, but I felt like it was the beginning.